A couple of weeks ago, I was walking through well, let's call it a wholesaler's market in Guangdong, sort of a meta mall where retailers actually go to buy their entire shopping line. They come not from other parts in China, but from all over the world. Now, I didn't have any particularly good reason to be there. I was just taking in the air, just taking in the global supply chain. But I was there with a couple of friends of mine, Craig and Huya, and they actually did have a real reason to be there. I'll get back to that in a minute. As I was passing by a mountain of distressed cargo shorts, I heard one shopkeeper say to another, by way of goodbye, the phrase, "好生意." Now, it basically means goodbye, but it's not really that commonly used. It literally means, I wish you good business. Now, I overanalyze China for a living, so it's pretty easy for me to read too much into phrases like this. I fall down those rabbit holes pretty quickly. I start picking apart the meanings of the word, trying to find extra significance, and it occurred to me that 生意, the word for business, is comprised of the word for life and the word for meaning, and doesn't that mean that commerce and life are intimately linked in China, or does it just mean see you later? I know all languages have this, but China has a particularly lot of phrases where the meaning of the word has been obscured by distance and time. Here's another one, 真金, which literally means real gold. It was used by Chinese traders and prospectors a couple of centuries ago to validate their product, tell their fellows that this was the real deal. Now, this is so obscure now, it's not even really used in China at all, but it is used here. If I bastardize it into Cantonese, and I've only lived in Hong Kong for 15 years, so apologize for my mispronunciation, it's pronounced dingum or dinkum. Now, this one I do want to pick up on a little bit more. Fair dinkum points to a long and shared history between China and Australia. It also, in the character for gold buried in there, says quite a lot about what defines that relationship today, natural resources. But in the essence, in the spirit of the word, in its trusting nature and the friendly delivery of it, or supposed friendly delivery, I'm still not very good with my Australianisms, I'm seeing something of Australia's future with China. I see the future of this relationship, an incredibly unique relationship that I'm going to argue is one of the most valuable economic relationships in the world. And I'm going to say to you that rather than being afraid of the dependency you all have on China, you need to do more to embrace it and make the most of it. And I'm going to ask you to do that not just for your own sake or for China's sake, but for all of our sakes. You Australians have the power to make the most out of China and, in so doing, better our prospects for global peace and prosperity. So no pressure there. If you think about the way China has gone in the last 20 years and where it's going, China is on a course to be an economy larger than the US in about 10 years. It's about half the size of the US today. Both are probably going to cross when they're $22 trillion economies. Now, if you assume that China is driving the rest of Asia's growth, and you would not be wrong to assume so, China and the rest of Asia, which comprise about 25% of world output today, are going to be close to 40% 10 years' time. Now, I've wrapped up Australia into that, but Australia is, in some sense, a bit of a rounding area. Australia's economy is about 1/5 of China's today. It'll be only about 10% of China's in 10 years' time. But there's something particularly important in the Australian story. Unlike any other rich country in the world, you all have had a 21-plus year unbroken record of economic expansion. Now, A lot is made about the fact that this is due to a selling of rocks and crops, and it is true. Exports have fueled a fairly long and rugged economic expansion. And if you assume that China, which buys 1 in every $4 of what you produce, has demand to last, then so too should Australia's economic progress into the decade to come. So Australia and China are indelibly linked. Yet China's rise also creates anxieties for Australia and everyone else. The source of those anxieties are probably too numerous to mention, so I'll just skim 3 off the top. China's growth is unsustainable. Its hunger for resources and its fast-paced growth is far too unsustainable in that it's going to consume land and gold and assets from everyone else and perhaps create geopolitical tensions. China's growth is unfair. It uses a managed currency, and it uses cheap production to essentially rob the rest of the rich world of jobs and manufacturing prowess. And the third is perhaps a little bit more of an ideological one, that China is simply built on other processes. Its values, its business practices are too far removed from the rest of the rich world, and that gap will never be bridged. Now, I accept that all these reasons are valid, but I also think that Australia stands to benefit more from their existence than not. China consumes a lot from Australia, but that can be transformed into something much more sustainable and valuable. Take natural resources for a second. Now, I know you guys don't produce a lot of oil, but China does consume quite a bit out of it. Last 10 years, China's consumption of oil has doubled in time. It's now the world's largest consumer of oil. It consumes half the world's steel. It consumes half the world's nickel, half the world's aluminum. Now, part of that is due to its own demand, its own growth, but it's important to note that quite a lot of its growth is in service of global manufacturing. China is producing things that the rest of the world wants. So if you leave aside the uncomfortable fact that the rest of the world is partially responsible for China's rapacious appetites, and you start to focus on what can be done about that, you start to see something very significant in China's attitude to its demand for resources. Yes, it's obsessed with buying mining companies, and China will buy farmland from you and African nations and whoever else will sell it to them for time for the foreseeable future. However, if you think that China is really concerned about security rather than the resources, you start to see a different picture of what's motivating China. World on R&D into sustainable energy. It's the world's biggest spender on clean coal technologies, biofuel, on biomass, sun, solar, wind, the whole gamut. China also, in about 20 years' time, will probably spend 1 in every $4 on producing this energy. So China is perhaps the single largest source of our future sustainable energy growth. Australia's sustainable energy industry, your own green technology initiatives, they could all be appended, if you like, to the massive amount of research and resources that China is expended to that. You already have a trade-linked story through the, if you like, old school resources. This, I believe, could be easily leveraged into a new energy story. Now, leveraging China's manufacturing of all things is important for businesses. China obviously has built its economic growth on the fact that it has the world's largest population and fastest growing economy, fastest rate of urbanization, but a lot of that's changing. Costs in China are rising quite substantially. a lot of that is due to demographics. For thanks to the one-child policy, China's workforce, which is just under 1 billion people today, will actually shrink from about next year. And slowly, China will start to shed workers. It will be an economy that will have about 70 million less workers than it had even today. The rest of Asia will have a demographic dividend. This means, of course, that some producers will obviously shift manufacturing, and that's something that we are seeing. Nike, for instance, has moved the largest share of its global production to Vietnam now. And there's a pipe dream of sorts that says this is going to keep happening until eventually the jobs are going to come back. The Chinese manufacturing system is going to price itself out, and the rest of the world will be the beneficiary. I don't think that's going to happen, and I think that's okay. For while costs are rising, China's efficiency is also growing. Just as it consumes more oil than anybody else in the world, it also consumes more industrial robots. Over this period of time, the last 5 years, when wages in China almost doubled, China's share of world exports of apparel actually increased. So China is becoming more expensive, but it's also becoming more efficient. And that brings us back to Craig and Huya. Craig is a South African clothing retailer. He runs a few stores across the country, and he can't get his stock in South Africa or Mauritius or Egypt or any place else at the price points and the quality he needs anywhere else than this mega mall he's shopping in now. Huya, she works for a friend of his, a South African designer, who produces over 100 items of couture a season, largely because every sequin and button and piece of satin that he ever could possibly need is within a 10-minute bicycle ride of this town, Human, which has over 1,000 textile factories and 5,000 garment companies. The intensity of supply chains is what makes China productive, and it's what makes these small businesses productive and globally nimble. I've lived in Hong Kong for a long time, and a few years ago I moved slightly off the grid to a fishing village. One of my neighbors there was someone who was used to living off the grid, a West Australian named Rob, who sailed the world for many years, well, sailed other people's yachts for many years, and finally landed in Hong Kong and started a business called PackSafe, which makes bags that you just can't break into. They've all got all kinds of crazy high-tech polymers and things, and does a good business here in Australia and around the world. But again, you know, there's some crazy technology in this bag that is simply unable to be innovated with the speed and time and intensity that can be done anywhere else in the world but the Pearl River Delta. So, in short, China is the source of Australia's wealth today. I think it will be the source of Australia's innovation for this foreseeable future. China has a platform that can be leveraged. Small businesses, entrepreneurs, they are ones that can benefit the most from this. You shouldn't regard that prowess as something that is needed by the rest of the world. Now, I put this burden on you, Australia, because you're our only hope. The US can't bend China's will. There's too much baggage. Canada, well, it's another resource-rich, multicultural, friendly country, but it's just not in the right time zone. Other BRICS, India, Brazil, they don't have the experience to guide China into the future. Australia has goals and aspirations, particularly around its own sustainability initiatives, particularly about the role it wants to play in Asia. Only Australia has, if you like, the innate lack of competitiveness coupled with the depth and breadth of relationship with China to really kind of transform that dialogue into something more sustainable for the time to come. Now, China is a land of aspiring dreamers. So is Australia. In fact, I argue that no two other countries on the planet are as defined, have their national character as defined by aspirations and dreams and goals as China and Australia. And that's the wonderful thing about this relationship. Yes, it is rooted in fairly transactional rocks and crops economies, but look at this. It's also rooted in the desires of Chinese students to better themselves. Australia's exports of aspirations, if you like, are something really powerful, something that can really be leveraged in bettering your ties with China. China is well and truly seeing Australia as a place where it can realize its dreams. Its dreams are very tactile and pragmatic now. They will be more, if you like, spiritual in the time to come. And, you know, fair dinkum, you guys have got a pretty good setup here. But I'd have to ask yet again that in letting China realize its dreams through you, that you become a little bit more comfortable with realizing your dreams through China. That's just good business. Thank you for your time.